Hello. Thanks for tuning into Breakthrough Dialogues, the podcast for pragmatists and problem solvers brought to you by the Breakthrough Institute. I'm Alex Trembath, Communications Director at Breakthrough.
And I'm Emma Brush, Managing Editor of the Breakthrough Journal.
At Breakthrough Dialogues, we sit down with some of the world's leading thinkers to talk about modern and technological solutions to environmental problems. Listen regularly and you'll learn about energy and climate change, conservation and human development, food and farming, urbanization and industrialization, and more.
If you like our show, you can subscribe to Breakthrough Dialogues on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, Overcast, or whatever your favorite app is.
For this episode, we talked to Jenny Splitter. Jenny is a science journalist whose work has focused on the intersection of food, technology, and consumer health. She's also one of the Science Moms, a group of moms with a blog, a podcast, and a lot of expertise on the health and nutrition impacts of consumer products. She's been published at Slate, The Washington Post, Salon, The Outline, and very recently, The Breakthrough Journal. As Breakthrough researchers and others have shown, intensive meat production can use fewer environmental resources like land and water and produce less greenhouse gas emissions. But do those benefits come at the expense of animal welfare? Not necessarily. For her essay in our journal, Jenny visited Tiffany Cattle, a feedlot operation in Kansas, to learn what industrial beef production really looks like. What she found may surprise you. Jenny Splitter, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So when people think about feedlots, I think what they mostly picture are these sort of horrifying, crowded, polluted places full of suffering animals. They smell awful, basically everything wrong with the modern food system. You visited Tiffany Cattle, which is a feedlot in Kansas. Can you tell us what your impression was there and what struck you most about that place?
Sure. Yeah, I visited Tiffany Cattle in Herington, Kansas, which is a very, very small town. And I was struck by how calm the cows were and how curious they were. I just had never probably seen that many of them that many cows in one space. And they're very unique creatures as both the Tiffany brothers. And I also visited with a cow and calf producer later that day. Were both telling me is just how unique cows are. They're very communal. They like their friends. They like to hang out with groups. They're very curious. So they're all of a sudden, large groups of cattle are staring at me as I'm walking down this large path to the office of Tiffany Cattle. And I don't know what I was expecting. I don't think I necessarily had a set of expectations in mind. I was pretty open to the experience. But it was just interesting to see these huge animals and how much personality they all have. Some of them are lying on the ground napping, and some of them are grouping together, kind of checking me out. And it was a little daunting to walk down this long path with so many cows all checking out me walking down. And I think in my mind, I was sort of treating them as these like precious animals as well. Like I'm going to park and not, drive my car down the lot. I don't want to disturb anybody. And meanwhile, there's a truck further away moving around and they're sort of ignoring it and more like, who is this lady who clearly has no idea, who's never been in Kansas before, who's checking us out. So it's just interesting. They know the cowboys that come to visit them every day, but they don't know me. So I don't know if I expect them to have quite as much personality as they did.
But it sounds like they're pretty intelligent, resilient creatures. You mentioned they're like hanging out in groups, that they weren't disturbed by you or your car. I'm not getting a picture of a group of terrified, tortured animals in a feedlot.
No, and they do choose breeds. They do tend to choose breeds that are docile. So they are by design kind of relaxed to begin with. But yeah, they don't have as much room as, say, a huge wide open pasture, but they do have room to move around. Each kind of cordoned off area still has like a little hill. They're not a well-managed feedlot is the most important aspect, is that they're dry and clean. And so that's what I noticed in all of these separate areas that made up the larger feedlot, is that they're kept very dry and clean. And that's kind of one of the primary jobs of the cowboys that go in every day.
Okay, how illustrative of U.S. beef production is Tiffany Cattle? Is this a typical feedlot? Do we get most of our beef from feedlots?
So yeah, we do get over 90% of the beef that's in production comes from a feedlot. And most of that beef is coming from probably the larger feedlots, and some of the ones at the top are just massive. And so Tiffany Cattle is actually somewhat smaller. I am horrible with numbers, but I believe it's about 27,000, a little more than that, between two different areas. They just purchased another farm. They had recently purchased one when I was visiting. So they're still large, but they're still a feedlot. They're still a corporate feedlot, quote unquote corporate feedlot, but in terms of their legal structure, I guess. But they're not as massive as some of the other ones that are in existence. And they also have this interesting kind of family relationship. It's two brothers who own it, though they didn't inherit the farm. They kind of purchased it from the former owner. But so they have sort of this interesting interplay of like family relationships and corporate structure to their feedlot. But I think in terms of what they do to keep the feedlot run well, there are similar things across the board in that it's going to come down to hiring cowboys who they have a good relationship with, that they can trust to go and tend to the animals if they fall sick and keep the areas really clean.
So I have to say that the picture that you're sketching sounds way more idyllic than what I'm used to kind of reading about in popular literature and media about feedlots. But I do know that there are some justified concerns about feedlots. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about that. What do people worry about most when they think about feedlots, and what concerns are misplaced, and which ones actually are justified?
I think, it depends on sort of environment versus, animal welfare. But because I think probably the biggest concern is runoff. And I think that's a justifiable concern. There are farms there are, people in agriculture working on it, but I think that's still a concern. When it comes to the treatment of animals, it seems there are trade-offs. So the animals have great care, or certainly a lot of care when you're in a feedlot, because their nutrition is so tightly scrutinized. And it's so overseen down to the last thing that they're eating. But that trade-off for that is that the animals have some less room to move about and kind of less quote unquote natural behaviors. They're not able to go wherever they want. They probably start out being able to roam about more because they're born somewhere else. They're born at usually a cow-calf producer farm, and then they're shipped off to a feedlot. And then the feedlot, that's where they're sort of fattened up before they're shipped off to a slaughterhouse. So there's all these steps along the way that all the producers have to get it right for the animal to have a good quality of life. And those are all opportunities for someone to not treat an animal well. And that's where an animal's welfare, won't be as great, and they won't have such great quality of life. So a lot comes down to who is overseeing the animal and the training along the way. I mean, past the feedlot, I watched a lot of Temple Grandin's videos about slaughterhouses, and they're not fun viewing. I wouldn't say it's, going to make you feel great about eating meat in a way, but they're very blunt and realistic, and they sort of show you if everyone does their job the right way, sort of that's kind of the way we can at least reduce suffering for animals, to not exacerbate kind of the end of their lives, exacerbate any suffering at the end of their lives.
Right. And that's a great point about feedlots being, by design, a system of incredible control. They're designed, particularly in countries like the United States and Brazil and Australia, they're designed to be super productive and super controlled, which, as you say, Jenny, is many steps along the path that can result in mistreatment or poor behavior. In your essay for the Breakthrough Journal, you talk about this as an opportunity to improve feedlot production sort of location, and operation by operation, as opposed to a means to oppose or reason to demonize feedlots.
Yeah. I mean, it just, no matter what, I think at this point, there's only so much grass-fed beef that can be produced. And it's just not going to compete with the amount of beef that feedlot system is going to produce. And especially as demand for meat rises kind of in the developing world and other places, that's the system we've got. So ideally, there's some incentive for feedlot owners to treat their cows well. And there is in that, a calm cow, it will be a better tasting cow, and they want to keep customers happy. And Sean and Shane Tiffany both mention their customers over and over again, and they're very motivated by that. And so, in an ideal world, that incentivization kind of helps optimize animal welfare. That doesn't always happen, but that is something that's sort of the ideal that feedlot operators get a sense of by treating their animals well, and by kind of making sure that they're well cared for, and that they're hitting all these targets for animal welfare, that they'll also be able to make money, because that's usually, from writing about agriculture in not just animal ag, but other areas of agriculture, that's what farmers care about. It's part of what they care about. They have to make a living, and they want to be profitable. So ultimately, if animal welfare can overlap with that kind of incentivization, then it helps everyone.
Yeah, that's what was really interesting to me about your essay, Jenny, was that there is an ideal here, that meat production and beef production really in particular is always going to have significant impacts, obviously on animal life and welfare, but also on environmental outcomes. But that we do actually know, thanks to quite a lot of work by ranchers and farmers, on how to make these systems of production more productive, more efficient, and in many cases, Tiffany Feedlot sounding like being one of them, in many cases, that productivity can come along with gains in animal rights and animal welfare, even as we are sort of fundamentally breeding and raising animals for slaughter for our consumption.
Right. I mean, they have been looking at fever tags as one innovation, that they'd be able to detect an animal sick before they're even displaying symptoms. They're also using parasitic wasps to help manage flies in the summer. So they're always looking for ways to kind of improve the overall the quality of the feedlot and to make things a little better. I think ideally just to make sure that they have a good product, which they hammer home over and over again. But so they use parasitic wasps and they use fever tags. And so I think they use both of those. They're kind of really interested in all these new innovations because both of them are fairly young, which is kind of unique in agriculture. Farmers generally have had a challenging time kind of bringing in the next generation. And so I think because they're unique in that they did grow up working on the feedlot, but they're also still relatively young to be owners of a feedlot, that they are really interested in looking at new technologies to kind of improve their own systems.
Yeah, well, that's always interesting to me, the discussion of how science and technology can help something like welfare. It's definitely counterintuitive. But talk to us a little bit about what that looks like. Beyond Tiffany Cattle, what's the kind of cutting edge technological fix to welfare problems?
Well, I don't know that there's an overall huge technological fix. I mean, I think probably the most important thing is just having quality veterinary staff that are aware of sort of new developments. And I think also looking at reducing antibiotics overall and being kind of smarter about and more efficient about how they deploy those. I didn't dive into antibiotics too deeply in this article, but I know that there are companies looking at vaccines as an alternative to using antibiotics and overall trying to reduce the use of antibiotics. So I think that's one area where, especially raising meat all over the world, is a kind of a huge pressing issue, and where I think developing technology can hopefully make some gains. And I think ultimately it's technology paired with people, because whenever you're dealing with animal agriculture, you still need those cowboys to go in and just and tend to the animals and see how they're doing. So you kind of always need that personal touch. But you also need people who are willing to examine new technologies and be open to new technologies. Tiffany Cattle, they grow GMO corn right there nearby, and they feed that to their cattle along with other corn that's kind of locally grown near them. And so I think, and then they talk about, they use cover cropping as a technique, and they go and talk to other farmers about that. And so I think that kind of blend of being open to using the people that they've known forever kind of working on that feedlot and having that tradition, but also having new technologies like the parasitic wasps or the fever tags, that combination, I think it seems to me to be the most interesting and effective.
From a consumer perspective, will technology always kind of stand in the way of our embrace of certain types of improvements like the ones you mentioned? I mean, you mentioned GMO corn, and obviously GMO crops are hugely controversial, rightly or wrongly. But what do you think it is about using technology on farms that kind of gets under people's skin?
I think the biggest disconnect, and even though I've been writing about agriculture for a while, this piece really opened my eyes to how every aspect of farming, I think whether you're on an organic farm or a small farm or a large farm, is going to be engineered to some degree. It's just kind of this disconnect that's one type of farming. There's this kind of false belief that small farms or organic agriculture, or that there's one kind of farming system that's more natural and less technological and maybe more connected to the land than another. And I don't think that's true at all, because ultimately farms are trying to feed some group of people, even if they're just trying to feed people locally, or if they're a massive farm trying to feed tons of people, they're still trying to kind of maximize their resources. And they're still always trying to make things better. And so I think on their own farms, they're always going to be trying to improve. And so whether it's GM technology, or it's a different breeding method, or it's buying manure from the feedlot, and you're an organic farmer in Herington, Kansas, there is still going to always be some technical aspect to the farm. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. It's still people involved. There's still, if you love the food that's being produced and you are interested in meeting your farmer, at the farmer's market, that's still happening, even if that farmer is also using technology to improve the quality of life on their farm or to improve their business. So I think the idea that it's separated is just a false idea.
Yeah, so I want to return to this bigger question of the sort of technological versus the natural when it comes to agriculture. In that vein, I wanted to ask you about alternative forms of beef production. In particular, I'm talking about grass-finished beef. I'm talking about pasture-raised beef. So as you mentioned, the cattle at Tiffany Cattle Feedlot weren't born there. They didn't spend the beginning of their life there. Pretty much all cattle are born and initially raised on pasture, on grasslands, and then either finished on grasslands or finished in pasture. And I think, the happy cows come from California idea is that cattle raised on pasture, cattle raised their whole life on grasslands are happier, better animal welfare outcomes. Also, sort of in a conflation, better outcomes for the environment, better outcomes for the consumer. So can you talk a little bit about this alternative production system, about pasture, about grass-finished cattle? In your essay, you write, freedom to roam on a pasture also means freedom to succumb to predation, extreme weather, deprivation, and disease. So are pasture and grass-finished cattle the sort of better, perfect systems that I think a lot of consumers think they are?
I don't think so, because, as I mentioned in that piece, that there's downsides and risks to a full pasture-based system as well, because there's more up in the air. There's less that's less controlled than a feedlot, where you know exactly where the animal is every step of the way. There was a new study that came out about grass-fed systems and carbon sequestration. And one of the things that struck me about it is because this study sort of had different results than some other studies about grass-fed systems. And what was different is that it was a very highly managed grass-fed system. So I think what is starting to emerge is that this idea that sort of letting them roam naturally is necessarily always the best for both animal and environment maybe isn't necessarily correct. You want to have kind of a balance. Maybe the animals want to have freedom to roam, but also proper management kind of ensures maybe a better outcome in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, that could be sort of one interesting takeaway from a big picture look at beef production in general, is that if you're looking for improved outcomes for animals, for consumers, for the environment, more management is usually better than less management. And that can mean maybe less aggressive interventions like planting trees on pasture or growing really productive grasses, or it could mean more intense interventions like moving cattle to feedlots and feeding them grain as they finish their lives and things like that.
Yeah, and one of the issues for consumers is that there's so many different labels and it's not always consistent what kind of quality of life the animal gets. An organic system may not necessarily be grass-fed system, and then a grass-fed system doesn't necessarily mean they have that much room to roam about. Same with an organic system. They don't necessarily have the amount of room that they have to roam varies kind of by farm. It's not as strictly regulated as consumers might expect.
So just to throw a little bit of a curveball at this conversation, I guess when we're comparing grass-fed and grain-fed beef, talking about these different systems of beef production and environmental impact and animal welfare, I guess the kind of most obvious question is, well, why can't we just stop eating beef altogether? I mean, it's bad for the environment and for the animals themselves, even if we care for them better along the way. What's your sense? Is that possible at all?
Yeah.
What's the kind of response to that kind of question?
It seems like here and in some areas, people are eating less meat or less beef. It's not the case in the developing world, where as countries do better, people want to eat more meat. And it also doesn't seem like people are going to all across the board in the US even become vegetarians. I try to kind of practice crop diversity and farming diversity on my plate when I can. So I had the Impossible Burger recently, which was excellent, if a little spendy, but well, expensive for a veggie burger, but it was tasty. And, I think eating a whole bunch of different variety of vegetables is a good thing you could do. So I try to kind of do that in my own home. And it's also just reflects my interest in both small farms and large farms. So I kind of try to do a mix, which seems to me to be the most, I don't know, it seems to fit with my life and be the most realistic, because I don't know that I have a lot of vegan friends, but I don't know that I see that becoming kind of so widespread.
Yeah, this is something that we return to at Breakthrough a lot, which is whether it's reducing our energy consumption or reducing our meat consumption or whatever sort of consumer behavior, some sort of radical consumer behavior ambition that other organizations and other people have. Often those ambitions are a little too radical based on the changes of consumer behavior we see over time. So beef consumption peaked in the 80s, but it's not like it has plummeted since then. And it is rising in the developing world. Meat consumption overall is actually increasing as people shift from beef to chicken and pork, which can have its own big environmental benefits, beef being a lot more environmentally demanding than chicken or pork are. But either way, as we advocate
and also I just have to say that I think it's important for people to look at each of the different systems, because the life of a chicken that lays eggs is different than the life of a pig. It's different than the life of a pig in China versus the US versus a cow, a beef cow versus a dairy cow. There's just so many, I think, different experiences that to me it seems difficult to kind of lump all those in together. I don't know that eating more chicken from an animal welfare perspective makes sense. I don't think that does. Yeah.
Certainly. And that's a super interesting and I think ultimately impossible to figure out trade-off. Chicken in particular is radically more environmentally efficient than beef, but in order to create the same number of calories and the same amount of protein, I don't know what the actual math is, but it's probably something in the neighborhood of 20 to 50 chickens per cattle. So if your ultimate value is an animal life, then you would want to eat more beef as opposed to more chicken. If your ultimate value is carbon emissions or runoff or land area used to produce calories, then you would want to eat more chicken. And that's ultimately a question of values.
And just to cut in, my understanding is also, Jenny, and I think you know better than I, but that beef cattle actually live a far better life than chickens do in at least American systems. Is that right?
Yes, I think so. Although I think, one of the things that's happening, I guess, in chicken production, although just from my understanding talking to other people, is that because there are a few large producers, they're kind of able to make changes across the board more easily, like on antibiotics, for example, that they can get a few companies like Tyson to agree and they're good. Whereas in beef, you have a lot of different players and people with very, very big independent streak who don't want to be told what to do, and gets very political. So I think in some ways, I think pork maybe might be kind of the most difficult to kind of rein in as an industry for various reasons. But it seems like chicken in the last few years has kind of improved because they're able, advocates are able to kind of get just a few people, only need to get a few people to the table to make changes.
Huh. That's really interesting.
That's my understanding from speaking to someone at the last Breakthrough conference.
Well, good.
Yeah, and that is, it leads me back to, again, sort of a fundamental insight of environmentalism, of eco-modernism, whatever, which is that consumers do have these demands, and whether beef consumption goes way up this century or way down, we'll want that beef consumption to be both as efficient and productive and environmentally responsible as possible and as respectful of animal rights as possible. And production systems like at Tiffany Cattle Feedlot look closer to an ideal than A, I think many consumers have, and B, probably many other feedlots. You mentioned the Impossible Burger. That is one other pretty radical but potentially, breakthrough intervention that we could make into meat consumption. Point being that there are these technological and management solutions that make sense sort of regardless of what the aggregate national or global consumption of these products is.
And one other aspect I forgot to mention that I'm really interested in is just the different options that scientists can use to breed animals that can actually improve welfare. We're only, I think, we've been seeing it for a while, but with hornless cows, that was more, I think, on the dairy side. And I think it mentioned lower fat pigs, using CRISPR to engineer lower fat pigs. They can also breed chickens to have fewer problems with their legs. And so that's another one of those areas that I think consumers are really squeamish about, but ultimately has so much potential to make farming better for animals and better for the environment, potentially, possibly cutting down on cow emissions. There's just so many different options, I think, once we open the door for genetic engineering.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, we're really just at the cusp of this conversation, especially with consumers, about these kind of opaque, maybe scary interventions into our meat. But I do predict that it'll be pretty revolutionary this century, whether it's things like genetically modifying breeds so that they're more productive or more comfortable. You see similar things in seafood with the Aqua Advantage salmon, trying to make salmon through genetic engineering more productive, can live off of vegetarian feeds and things like that, or whether you get into really radical technological solutions like actual in vitro lab-grown meat. And like the Impossible Burger is one thing. Growing animal tissue in a vat or in a petri dish is another. At scale, exactly, Emma. So the question then becomes one of: Are we sort of more grossed out by lab meat or in vitro meat or GMO animals, or are we more grossed out by like murdering sentient beings? There are really big both animal welfare and environmental questions there that I think it makes more sense to lay all our cards on the table and sort of be honest about what the value trade-offs are, instead of, as you say, sort of hiding behind labeling confusion or hiding behind confusion about what these production systems look like, described myopically.
Right. And I think farmers also need to there's a lot of push for transparency, and I think a lot of farmers have stepped up to that, but there's also still kind of a huge amount of defensiveness from farmers and agriculture, of not wanting to be told how to farm, and well, if you don't like it, go grow your own food. And I sure it isn't. No one likes to be criticized on Twitter every day. Who does? But
I love it.
But it's my life. But I think that people have to be open to that conversation, because we're all eaters, and so it's not going anywhere. So I think animal ag has to kind of there's certain stock phrases that you hear often, like I wouldn't hurt my own family. My family works on the farm, and things like that, where we need to move past that and have conversations about why farmers make the choices they do, and sort of how do you incentivize better choices that are good for the farmer, but also that are going to improve the environment, improve animal welfare, given sort of the current political environment, the regulatory environment, and kind of the issues there. I think it's going to be challenging, but I think that's ultimately where I'd like to see some change. And I do think the conversation would be much better if all sides, including farmers, kind of accepted that there is going to be a lot of challenge there from consumers. I mean, I don't see consumers backing away from caring about their food anytime soon. I'd love it for them to have a little more information when they do that, but I think the conversation's not going to be shut down. So I just don't think that's not going away.
Yeah, are you optimistic in the coming decades about the ability of American consumers and consumer advocates and journalists and think tanks to have sort of a smart, productive conversation about innovative technology, innovative management practices in food and agriculture?
I've become more optimistic recently in the last few months, just because I think large scale, persuading somebody is with perhaps, one conversation or one piece is maybe unlikely. But I've been writing about these issues for a while, and I notice in sort of in everyday life and in ongoing conversations, once people kind of come to have an understanding of who you are, where you're coming from, and trust that you're giving them accurate information, there is a kind of an exciting possibility for conversation. And as someone who also tells stories in my other life and does a lot of different kinds of writing, I'm really excited about the different forms of communication. And I find, I'm not afraid of an argument, but I find kind of endless Twitter debates only fun when I have nothing else to do, other than clean my kitchen. But I think that it's interesting when you really put yourself out there, I think, as a writer, and you, I think, spend the time trying to connect with someone on a personal level. It's a very slow process, but I do actually see so many interesting conversations happening that way. And I was really excited to see different conversations like that happening at Breakthrough. It's why I really wanted to write for the journal. And I thought it was so great to see people really being willing to have these difficult conversations. And I kind of took that away in my regular life, because DC is is just a hotbed of like all different kinds of opinions and people who have to see each other every day, but maybe come from different viewpoints or walks of life. And I used to sort of shy away from what I write about and not want to say in public that I write about GMOs, because I didn't feel like having a debate, when I'm picking up my kids from school. But I just decided to kind of get over it. And so now I just put myself out there, and I kind of just am not afraid to have the conversation. And I'm not afraid for there to be a disagreement, because I think one of the lessons we learn is that you're not going to change someone's mind in one conversation. It has to be many conversations. So with that in mind, it's kind of changed how I kind of look at it. And so I used to be very pessimistic, and I enjoyed my pessimism, and I still do sometimes. But I think I'm also optimistic that I think if you're open for long, ongoing dialogues with people, that can take you in interesting places, and that's what makes life interesting.
Well, yeah, in the spirit of that kind of bold open-minded, optimistic attitude. You care to share a specific conversation you had that led you to feel more optimistic, or is there another kind of example of progress that you see in the world today? We like to ask our guests that once in a while.
Well, so I spent a year avoiding emailing my rabbi about something on the Hebrew school curriculum, if you want to get very specific.
Yeah, sure.
Because so there's a Jewish holiday called Tu B'Shvat, which is the celebration of trees, but also in Reform Judaism, it's kind of become this environmental celebration. And so I believe had made this checklist that had gone home with my kids that was advocated for buying organic agriculture and buying from small farms and buying only small local farms. And I thought, oh God, I don't want to have a fight with my rabbi. Like, I can't do it. So I kind of just kept putting it away and putting it off and ignoring it. And honestly, it took me an entire year. And then I finally just bit the bullet. And it was actually based on hearing, I believe her name's Eugenie Scott. She has some interesting research, or she was summarizing the research on kind of what changes people's minds. And part of it is like shared values and ideology. And so I figure, who better than to try this out with my rabbi? We share similar background and similar values. And so I sent her this email and said, there's some evidence that organic agriculture is not necessarily better for the environment. And there might be other reasons, to keeping in mind Emma Maris's great essay about kind of local farms that really appealed to me. There might be other reasons that you might want to buy from a local farmer and kind of have that connection with a small farmer who's right near you, or experience nature, experience the farm. But that doesn't mean it's necessarily better for the planet. And it was actually just a surprise to her. No one had ever, mentioned this other point of view to her. So I sent her some links, not 27,000 links, but just some links and further reading on that, and she said, well, what should we say to people instead? And I said, well, how about eating less meat, but how about also practice crop diversity on your plate? And I have, here's some recipes that do that. And so we had this great back and forth about the, kind of not quite a meeting in the middle, but just acknowledging where she's coming from and what's important to her. Maybe not just efficiency for her, but also just telling her where I'm coming from, and that I care about the environment. And I'm also looking at this evidence and this data, and these are not easy questions where there's no easy answers, but here are some things we could do. And maybe we don't, and in a way, just saying organic agriculture is kind of the easy answer. So let's dig a little deeper. And we had a great back and forth about that. And she changed the curriculum based on what I asked her to change. And it was great. We both kind of learned something from each other. So that's my most recent example.
I love that, Jenny. And that's great. Great to hear. I think we all have people in our lives who we disagree with, and we deliberately avoid bringing up those disagreements. So it's wonderful to hear about a conversation where you were both able to sort of express what your values are, what your perspectives are, not always to change the other person's mind, but just to have a more interesting and deep conversation and connection about this stuff. With that, Jenny, I want to thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It was very fun.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of Breakthrough Dialogues. If you liked what you heard, please tell your friends and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, Overcast, or whatever your favorite app is. Until next time, I'm Alex Trembath.
And I'm Emma Brush.
Thanks for tuning in.